had come down the line the previous day that Norfolk Southern would be sending its business train from Altoona on a ferry move down to Birmingham, Alabama. Due to some undisclosed problem, the train overnighted in Bellevue, and by the time it left at just after 9 a.m. the next morning, the stars aligned for a daylight trip down the Sandusky District. By the time I pulled into Marion at just past 9:30 a.m., the train was already well on its way, and I thought that this would be a rather quick outing. There was no way of knowing, but by the end of the day, it would turn out to be one of the best rail fanning outings I've ever had up in Marion. The first train to arrive, at least for me, was this northbound grain train, with NS engine number 4000 leading the way. Engine 4000 was the first AC 4400 C6M rebuild completed by Norfolk Southern, and it is specially painted to commemorate the occasion. Without warning, southbound train number 116 appears around the curve passing the tail end of the grain train. Quickly changing camera positions, we watch as 116 pulls south across the diamond, continuing its trip down to Watkins Yard and Columbus. While all of this had been going on, northbound CSX train L456 pulled up, and began the process of spotting cars bound for Marion. Today, the crew of 456 were dealing with a rather large cut. By the time they left, they only had about 10 to 15 cars to take with them to Walbridge. Things were moving rather quickly, as another NS grain train, this time going south, passes in front of the camera. This was the first of 3 southbound trains that were stacked in behind one another. An unusual cut of empty Department of Defense flat cars are seen toward the rear of today's 18M. A northbound loaded coal train is seen making its way up the former C&O Main. I had no way of knowing, but the C&O would be a rather active piece of railroad today. A rather eclectic collection of empty coal hoppers that I believe were just recently repaired, or maybe heading for storage somewhere, brings up the rear of the train. A rather short X008 is seen passing through the interlocking plan. What normally would be symboled I008, today's train is running as an extra, as earlier in the week, a derailment on the St. Louis line west of Indianapolis changed this train's origination point from East St. Louis, Illinois to Indianapolis. At the time this footage was shot in July, that derailment was still being cleaned up. The St. Louis line would be reopened a couple days later. Finally, here came the day's main event, Norfolk Southern Train number 955, the office car train, with both the Southern and Wabash Heritage units leading the way. After the executive train left the scene, most of the rail fans that were here packed up and left. I was initially going to be one of them, until the NS road channel lit up with an unusual train symbol, and I decided to wait around and see what it was. Before the mystery train from the north made its arrival known, however, northbound train number 117 gets there first. The mystery train turns out to be number 938, a southbound work train extra carrying all kinds of company machines. Up until recently, this kind of equipment would be attached to the front or the rear of manifest freights. Now they are starting to run as dedicated trains again. The day was getting better and better as it wore on. While I was in a drive-thru line getting myself something to eat, the NS Sandusky dispatcher notified a northbound train at Troyton that he had to wait for 3 southbound trains. Getting back over to the station, I had less than a minute to get prepared for the arrival of train number 179. Today's 179 was shorter than normal, but I wasn't complaining. In the midst of all this NS action, CSX train L339 slips by on the C&O main right on the heels of another southbound. I didn't get it on film, but I can tell you it was train number B407. Even more maintenance of way equipment is found deadheading on the point of CSX train M332. These type of equipment moves don't happen often, and seeing two of them in one day is not a common occurrence. At this point, I wanted to call it a day, and I'm glad I didn't, and you'll see why. A northbound welded rail train passes through on the C&O, and it's completely unexpected. I did some asking around, and no one knew where this train had come from or where it was going. All I know is when the train got to Fostoria, it made a right turn and headed east to Willard. I don't know where it went after that. Not even 10 minutes later, the northbound train the dispatcher was holding down there at Troyton makes its appearance. It is train number 178. As you may expect, it is the opposite movement to the 179 we saw earlier. A southbound loaded coal train makes an appearance on the opposite side of 178. I didn't get a train ID, but I know it came off the Fort Wayne line at Bucyrus. With no more NS trains in the immediate vicinity, the CSX Indy Line dispatcher is given freedom to run two movements that were stacked in. The first is train M363, which just got a fresh crew about 40 miles east of here in Crestline. The dispatcher informed them that they would be meeting an eastbound train out there at CP 105 just west of town, and it just so happens to be train number M364. We will move down to the throat of the Marion yard for the catch. Three GEs and one EMD are the power for this evening's 364. We are set up at the Kenton Avenue Railroad crossing, which is at the throat of CSX's Marion Yard. Marion Yard is a mere shadow of the facility that it once was. It once belonged to the Erie Railroad and included a hump and locomotive shop. Between Galleon and Marion, the Erie and the New York Central Railroad had joint trackage that they dispatched and maintained together. Joint trackage ended here in Marion, and the Erie's tracks turned to the northwest, eventually heading off toward Chicago. Marion Yard survived into the Erie-Lackawanna era, but after the Conrail consolidation, the majority of the Erie's main line was ripped out, and most of Marion Yard went with it. The locomotive shop is now owned by Union Tank Car, which is a tank car manufacturing firm. The yard also handles traffic for several local businesses. Looking at the way Marion Yard is today, it is hard to imagine the facility that it once was. At this point, two southbound trains appeared on the Columbus sub, both waiting for permission to cross the diamond after 364 cleared. Not knowing what to do, I eventually decided to go to a spot that will look very familiar to you if you saw my tour of the Columbus sub video. If you saw my video, Tour of the CSX Columbus sub, I mentioned about a location known as MD. MD is the location of an interlocking tower that used to control all movements on the C&O through Marion. However, I never showed what the tower actually looked like, so here it is. MD Tower remained in service all the way until the CSX era, not being taken out of service until the late 1980s. It is now used for material storage by the CSX track department. With the majority of these towers having been taken down over the years, it is good to know that this one is still standing and still being of good use to the railroad. When I pulled into MD, the two southbounds were just beginning to pull, and I had very little time to set up. This coal train is symboled as E611, empties bound for Russell, Kentucky. The other southbound is a grain train, but I never heard its ID. The engineer on the grain train throttles up his engines to get over the hill here at Marion, but eventually starts clawing back. The double track line singles up at a place called Owens, which is south of town, and the engineer wants to catch the green light to follow in behind the coal train. With light quickly fading, the Indy Line dispatcher has one more train to run. It is train M331, the sister to the 332 that we saw earlier. With the derailment still being cleaned up, there would be no more trains on the Indy Line for the next few hours. At just before 10 o'clock, one more NS train slips through Marion on its journey south. It is train 171, manifest freight for Chattanooga, Tennessee, coming out of the classification yard at Conway, which is just to the northwest of Pittsburgh. This evening's 171 has a freshly rebuilt SD40-3 dead in tow. With the passage of 171, I called it a day. This day's train count would end up at 30, which was way more than I thought I was going to see, and I ended up not getting all of them on camera. For the trains that I did catch, I hope you enjoyed them in this video compilation as much as I did. In my next video like this, we will be traveling up to Fostoria, enjoying a hangout with some of the members of my model railroad club. Until then, I'm signing off for the night. And as always, no matter the situation, go Buckeyes!